Before we actually get to the cortex, I want to talk about some of the surrounding protective layers that encompass and enclose the structure of the brain. And these are called the meningeal layers, or the meninges. There are three primary layers that I want you to be aware of. This is after, of course, we've removed the skull, or the scalp and the skull. And below that, what we'll find first is what's known as the dura mater. And the dura mater is a very, very thick substance, very leathery-like substance that shields the brain, encloses the brain. It encapsulates the cerebrospinal fluid that we'll talk about later, and serves as a protective meningeal layer. Below the dura mater, we find the arachnoid layer. And the arachnoid layer is a layer that has dual purposes, really. One, it helps to, again, encapsulate the brain, but also it helps to provide a support structure for much of the vasculature that surrounds the brain. So you'll notice in the image, as we remove the dura, what you can see are many of the blood vessels hidden in those sulci of the brain. And the arachnoid layer is partly responsible for enclosing and encapsulating those blood vessels. Below the arachnoid, we find the pia mater. And the pia mater actually, in many cases, is difficult to see. So you may look at an image of the brain and not realize that, in fact, the pia mater is still there. It's a very, very thin, translucent material that, again, helps to encapsulate the brain. Here are some images that show, again, these different meningeal layers. So we can see here an image with the skull that has been removed over the left hemisphere. And what you see below the skull is this first very thick dura layer, or dura mater. And what you can see is that it's very thick, and in fact the brain is not really recognizable as the brain with this dura mater intact. As we remove the dura mater, which is seen here as this very thick, leathery-like substance, what you find below is the arachnoid. So in this image, we see the brain. Now we can see some of those characteristic sulci and gyri, or the convolutions of the brain. But they're covered and still encapsulated by the blood vessels that are embedded in this arachnoid layer. Below the arachnoid layer, then, we find the pia layer. So now you'll notice that the brain below the arachnoid layer looks like you might expect the surface of the brain to look like, but in fact there's a very thin meningeal layer still covering the surface of the brain here. Once we've removed all of these meningeal layers, then we get to the cortex of the brain. Remember that the brain is organized such that gray matter or cell bodies exist on the exterior surface of the brain, and the white matter is contained within the brain. So you can see here the distinction between the gray matter or cell bodies out on the surface of the cortex and the white matter serving as conduits for information, both between the hemispheres and within the hemispheres. The cerebral cortex itself is only about 1.5 to maybe 4 millimeters thick, but its surface area is tripled by these convolutions. The surface of the convolutions are called gyri, and the spaces are called sulci. The convolutions are important because there have been many questions over the years about how the brain is related to intelligence and what structures are related to intelligence. And for many years it was thought that bigger brains meant more intelligent creatures, but we find that that's not actually true, and that what may be more important is rather than volume is surface area. And again, remember that I said that the surface area of the brain is tripled by these convolutions, or these gyri and sulci. So there's some images here of different brains of different animals. We can see the human brain here with its large frontal lobes and highly convoluted structure, and then some other animals. What is important to notice here is that for example, the manatee, which has a brain of somewhat comparable size to humans, has very little surface area in terms of the absence of relative absence of the convolutions of the brain. Therefore, we might expect that the intelligence level of the manatee may be somewhat lower, for example, than, say, the chimpanzee, which has a brain size of even more similar volume. As we begin to talk about the human brain and the cerebral cortex in particular, we first will note that the cerebral cortex is typically divided into 4 lobes. And importantly, these lobes correspond with the names that were originally given to the bones of the skull. So you might know already that there are 4 major bones of the skull, the frontal, parietal, temporal, and occipital bones that fuse together after we're born, of course. But the lobes of the brain were essentially named for these bones of the skull because of their corresponding location beneath the surface of the skull. So here we see an image with colored labels here. The red shows the frontal lobes, which are particularly large in human brains. The blue is the parietal lobe. The yellow shows the occipital lobe, and the green shows the temporal lobe. And this would be the left hemisphere of the brain, right? So this is the frontal or anterior portion of the brain, and the occipital lobe sits the most posterior pole of the brain. There are a number of landmarks that we use to define the lobes of the brain and also to locate important structures on the cortex of the brain. 3 of these major landmarks are the longitudinal fissure, which is the fissure that divides the 2 hemispheres of the brain. This is also sometimes referred to as the interhemispheric or longitudinal fissure. Then the central sulcus, which is shown here from a dorsal view, and here from a lateral view. The central sulcus is the space that divides the frontal from the parietal lobes. It will use this central sulcus to identify the primary motor cortex, which sits just anterior to the central sulcus. This is also sometimes called the Rolandic fissure. Finally, we have the lateral or Sylvian fissure. And this is the fissure that divides the temporal lobe from the frontal and parietal lobes. So there are other spaces that are sometimes used to help further define the occipital and temporal lobe, but we won't be looking into those in much detail in this course. So let's begin with these different lobes by talking about the frontal lobe. So the frontal lobe, again, sits anterior to the central sulcus, which is shown here. And I've highlighted, using the website that I gave you the link to, a couple of major areas of the frontal lobe. The lateral prefrontal cortex in its dorsal aspect, or the dorsolateral prefrontal cortex, and the ventral lateral prefrontal cortex. The frontal cortex is thought to control some of the most complex of all human behaviors. It includes the precentral gyrus, which is this primary motor cortex that sits just anterior to that central sulcus. So this is the home of the primary motor cortex, meaning that it is one of the final destinations for neural activity before muscle movements are executed by the body. And in fact, stimulation along the motor cortex will elicit involuntary movements in the extremities. So the primary motor cortex, again, here has been isolated, and you can see it sitting just anterior to that central sulcus. And one of the interesting things about the organization of this primary motor cortex is that it follows what's called a somatotopic organization, meaning that it is organized roughly as your body parts are organized on your body. So you can see here an illustration of that somatotopic organization, showing that this cortical real estate, for example, here on the medial surface of the the primary motor cortex, is devoted to the movements that are executed at the feet. As we move up and over the dorsal surface of the brain and down now the primary motor cortex, what we find is that adjacent parts of the body are represented by those neurons. moving all the way up to the face and the tongue, etc. This image on the right illustrates how the human body is represented on the primary motor cortex. So you may have noticed, for example, that the entire region of the body from basically the knees all the way up to now the head are represented on this space, and then nearly the same amount of cortical real estate is devoted to the face and up. So you can see that there is this distorted representation by the brain, and this representation is thought to reflect the kinds of information that are being processed along the cortex. So, for example, if you're thinking about motor control, it's much more important that we have fine motor control in our hands. So we need to devote a lot of real estate or a lot of computational power to the movements of the hands compared with, for example, the lower back. Whereas careful use of the hands and, of course, movements of the face for both speaking, emotional expression, and so forth, those kinds of motor movements all require a great deal of computational input. And so we see a lot of cortical real estate devoted to those areas. The frontal lobes are also home to regions like supplementary motor area and the lateral premotor cortex. And you'll find these regions just anterior to the primary motor cortex. So we'll start here on the right with the supplementary motor area, which lies on that medial surface between the two hemispheres. Then the lateral premotor cortex lies just anterior to the primary motor cortex. Anterior to that, we find large regions that are sometimes referred to as the prefrontal cortex. Now, in terms of the kinds of actions that these regions control, the medial prefrontal cortex, or medial supplementary motor area, is thought to be associated with well-learned action sequences. So whereas the primary motor cortex, when commands are issued from neurons in the primary motor cortex, what they generate are movements in specific parts of the body, the supplementary motor area seems to be responsible for sequences of movements that may involve multiple muscle groups. What it means to say that they are associated with well-learned action sequences is that it is as if the medial supplementary motor area is responsible for the kinds of actions that don't necessarily require interaction with the environment. So rolling your fingers, for example, sometimes people will roll their fingers along the desk. This is a relatively simple action sequence that doesn't really require you to interact a lot with the environment, and that kind of movement can be generated by commands issued by the medial supplementary motor area. The lateral premotor cortex, on the other hand, tends to be more involved with actions that involve some kind of interaction with the environment. What is important about this idea of interacting with the environment, and we'll get to this later when we talk about some of the other regions of the brain, is that you should begin to be thinking about how movement is completely related to other sensory processes. In other words, if we're moving around in the world, we are constantly using information from the senses in order to plan and coordinate our behaviors. And the lateral premotor cortex is thought to be one of the regions where many of these computations happen. So, for example, reaching out to grab your coffee cup. This requires interaction between the motor system, which is planning the movements, and the visual system, which is identifying which of the stimuli in your environment are the coffee mug. It requires that you make computations about how big the coffee cup is so that you know how to designate the aperture of your hand to make sure that it matches the coffee cup and you don't drop it. All of these kinds of computations involve some kind of interaction with the sensory system, which is getting information from the environment. Finally, the prefrontal cortex, at the most anterior portion of the frontal lobe, is thought to be responsible for some of the more complex kinds of behaviors that are generated by humans, things like goal maintenance, and I'll explain more about what that means. So the prefrontal cortex, part of which is illustrated here, I apologize, the program didn't allow me to illustrate just the entire prefrontal cortex, but this is a big portion of it here. This prefrontal cortex is involved in planning and organization, also has been related to processes like impulse control and complex decision making. And you may recall at the beginning of the semester I talked about Phineas Gage, and Phineas Gage was one of the cases that showed us that the frontal lobes were important for many of these complex functions, but not so much basic functions. So one could live, as in the case of Phineas Gage, with large portions of the frontal lobe missing. But what changed about Phineas Gage's behavior was that he became less able to do complex planning and organization, showed poor impulse control and poor decision making, childlike decision making as it was sometimes described. You may also remember or be aware of the term lobotomy, which is a surgical procedure that was used for a time, is no longer used, but was used for a time to subdue patients who were in psychiatric facilities and were essentially difficult to control or had become unmanageable. So physicians at the time would sometimes recommend these frontal lobotomies, which required entering the brain through the orbit of the eye, and then, for all intensive purposes, slicing around and making sure that the frontal lobe became disconnected from many other parts of the brain. This procedure was found to make patients more manageable and less volatile, but of course had many other inadvertent effects that were not appreciated at the time, but now make that procedure considered somewhat barbaric. Another region of the frontal lobes that we touched on briefly at the beginning of the semester is Broca's area. And Broca's area is found on this lateral ventral portion of the frontal lobe, in particular on the left hemisphere. Broca's area is known to be related to the production of speech, and damage to Broca's area can result in what's known as an expressive aphasia. So the term aphasia refers generally to the loss of ability to produce and or comprehend language. And an expressive aphasia is a term that reflects that specific loss of ability to produce language. So people with damage to Broca's area and what's now called Broca's aphasia are capable of understanding spoken language, but are incapable of producing language. Moving posterior then to the central sulcus, we get to the parietal lobes. And the parietal lobes are defined by this central sulcus. So they lie posterior to the central sulcus and dorsal to the sylvian or lateral fissure. You can see here I've mentioned this parieto-occipital sulcus, which is another small sulcus, but I won't ask you to identify that on any of the quizzes or exams. So the parietal lobes are the home of the primary somatosensory cortex, which is located here on the postcentral gyrus. So recall that the primary motor cortex was located on what's called the precentral gyrus. The primary somatosensory cortex is located on this postcentral gyrus. The somatosensory cortex and the remainder of the parietal lobes are responsible for processing all of the senses from the skin, like touch, warmth, cold, and pain, but also other kinds of perceptual processes like spatial processing and proprioception, or the awareness that you get about the position of your body and the movement of your body parts. The somatosensory cortex, again located just posterior to the central sulcus on this postcentral gyrus, the organization of the somatosensory cortex mirrors very closely the motor cortex, with some minor exceptions. So, for example, the genitals are represented on, again, this medial surface of the primary somatosensory cortex, but you don't see that represented on the motor cortex. But of course, we don't have very complex movements of the genitals, whereas we do have a lot of sensory information coming from those regions. Then again, though, however, you see this uneven distribution of real estate that is devoted to the different body parts. So the lower back is a good example again. parts of the lower back and torso don't get a lot of sensory input because we don't need a lot of detailed information about that part of our body, in part because we're not using it for very complex movements. However, as we move up to the head, hands, and face, now we find a lot of cortical real estate devoted to those sensory inputs. And in part, we need that sensory feedback in order to guide movements. So there's this very tight correlation between the distribution of cortical real estate to motor movements and sensory input. One of the interesting things about damage to the parietal lobes is that they can produce deficits that look like they are visual in nature. So one of the kinds of syndromes that occurs with damage to the parietal lobes is called hemifield neglect. And this is represented here by someone who has suffered damage to the right parietal lobe. And for reasons that aren't fully understood, these kinds of neglect syndromes tend to be more common in those with damage to the right parietal lobes, but that is not true in all cases. Hemifield neglect syndromes can be measured neuropsychologically using some very simple paper and pencil measures. So this on the left here, you see a couple of examples of what's known as sometimes as a letter cancellation task. So let's take a look at this top part of the image. What is being asked of patients is to find all of the A's and circle them. In this case, what you'll notice is that this patient has successfully located all of the A's on the right portion of the exam sheet, but they've missed a lot of A's over here in the left part of their visual scene. What's thought to be happening here is not that they are incapable of identifying A's, but they are unable to locate those A's spatially or attend to those A's when they occur in the visual field that is contralateral to the region of damage. So again, damage to the right hemisphere leads to a loss of not so much sensory but perceptual input, or the allocation of attention over the left part of the visual world. You see another example of that down here. Some other really unusual examples of hemifield neglect come from the drawing tasks. So these are examples, real examples, of a patient who's been asked to draw a number of simple household kinds of items. So a flag, a tree, a smiley face, a house. And in this case, what you notice is that half of these images are missing. What's really unusual is that these drawings were produced by a person who perceives these as whole objects. So the person who drew these doesn't have any perceptual notion that there's something wrong with these images, that only half of them are there. And it seems to be because the damage to the right parietal lobe is allowing this person to essentially ignore this part of the visual world. On the far right, we see another example. This is sometimes called a clock drawing task, and this is used very frequently in the neuropsychological field. And what you can see is that we have many of the numbers represented, even the time is shown. So this person drew the clock fairly well and seemed to manage to get the circle. But when it came to identifying the little pieces of the clock, or the little bits like the numbers and so forth, that essentially the left part of the clock was neglected by this patient. So they perceived this as a complete clock, despite the fact that, in addition to maybe a couple of other errors here, in addition to the fact that it's missing numbers completely on the left side. One of the other ways that people have tried to measure these neglect syndromes are using eye tracking tasks. So here's a task where the lines indicate, the red dots indicate fixation points where the eyes have been fixated, and the lines track that movement of the eyes from location to location. And what you'll notice is that the patient, when looking through this display of angles, keeps their eye movements restricted to the right visual field. So it's as if they've forgotten that this left visual field is important or part of their sensory world. The temporal lobes are another rather interesting lobe of the brain in that they seem to be responsible for a number of different sensory and cognitive functions. First of all, on the dorsal surface of the temporal lobe, we find the primary auditory cortex. So this is a region of the brain that is getting direct input from the ears and processing of simple sounds. Beyond the primary auditory cortex, we find both visual and auditory association areas. So these are areas, particularly as we move ventrally on the temporal lobe toward the ventral temporal lobe region, we find areas that seem to be responsible for object identification, both in the visual and auditory domains. Another area of the temporal lobes that's important, and it sits really at the junction between the temporal lobe and the parietal lobe, is what's known as Wernicke's area. Wernicke's area is connected directly to Broca's area by the arcuate fasciculus that we'll talk about in a later section. So there is a direct axonal connection between these two regions of the brain, and the Wernicke's area is thought to be an important area for receptive speech, so our ability to comprehend language. Notice that it's very close to the primary auditory cortex, which is kind of sitting down here. So we have the primary auditory cortex getting simple auditory inputs, and then the areas like Wernicke's area, which are putting some of those sounds together and helping us to comprehend sequences of sounds, as are the case in spoken language. If you have damage to Wernicke's area, you can develop what's known as a receptive aphasia. Remember that an aphasia is a problem producing or understanding language. In the case of a receptive aphasia, the difficulty that patients have is with understanding spoken language, even though they're able to produce language without much problem. So we already talked about the fact that temporal lobes house these visual and auditory association areas and object identification. This ability to identify objects, of course, is closely related to a concept of memory. Our ability to identify something is based on the idea that we've learned how to label this object. And in fact, there was a famous study done by Wilder Penfield in the 1950s where he stimulated the brains of awake patients. So he stimulated parts of the ventral temporal lobe, and patients would report that they were experiencing memories, or in some cases would hear music playing, some memory of a particular song. In other cases, they experienced memories of very specific instances in their life. When you have damage to the temporal lobe, the neuropsychological condition that can result is what's known as an object agnosia. So this would be a deficit where someone was unable to, for example, name what a telephone is. If looking at a telephone, they might not recognize it as a specific object or the label that's associated with that object. So to demonstrate this, I've got this rather old video, but it's one of the best that I can find that shows this object agnosia.
I'm going to give you a choice, and you tell me what this is.
Okay, I can tell you then.
Okay. Is this a clock, a lock, or a telephone?
A lock.
Is it a lock?
A clock, a lock, or a telephone? Okay, let's rule out. Let's rule out a telephone. What? A clock or a lock? Clock. Gotta be a lock. Must be a lock then.
Are you sure?
No, I'm not. But I don't recognize it as a telephone.
Mm-hmm. Do you recognize it as a lock?
No, honestly, I don't. But it's just it really looks very indescript to me.
But your hands know what they want to do.
I know, and they want to do something.
That's right.
You know, I can see them. You know, I can just picture them, and I know that I have. It's like I'm undoing a combination lock.
Good. Okay, good. We had to work on that one, didn't we?
No shit.
That's okay.
Okay, so there's our example of a nice example of this object agnosia. And what is interesting is that, and she points this out in the video, is that it's as though his hands knew what they wanted to do, but he couldn't quite get there to the label of the object, had trouble identifying what it was based only on the visual input. And it wasn't until his other systems got involved, so for example, his motor system, which kind of knew the actions that went with it, gave him some other feedback, and then he was able to finally get to this recognition. The last of the four lobes that we'll talk about today are the occipital lobes. So the occipital lobe is identified here by the parieto-occipital sulcus, which is a small sulcus I won't ask you to identify, and the preoccipital notch, which I will not ask you to identify on a quiz or exam. The occipital lobe is home to the primary visual cortex, which really occupies mainly this medial surface of the brain, so the space here just between the two hemispheres. And the primary visual cortex is the one of the earliest destinations for afferent signals from the optic nerve. So it is getting direct information, nearly direct information, from the retina of the eye. The secondary areas of the occipital cortex, so as we move, if we're looking at the lateral surface here, the primary motor cortex really sits at this occipital pole and then most of the medial surface. But as we move laterally and forward toward the parietal lobes, what we find are these secondary visual areas that are specialized for certain kinds of sensation, visual sensations. So there are regions that are specialized for color processing, others that are specialized for the processing of movement across the visual scene, some that are specialized for picking out shapes and form. With damage to the primary visual cortex, the kind of deficit that you'll see is what's called a scotoma. And this is a really unusual area of blindness in the visual field. So you'll get a little spot, essentially. If I were to take a little melon scoop and scoop out a section of primary visual cortex, what would happen is that an area of my visual field would just turn into this little gray spot. And I would no longer be getting information about that part of the visual world. We'll talk in a minute about this retinotopic organization that defines the visual cortex, and we'll talk a lot about that when we get to our section on vision. Another really interesting disorder that can occur with damage to the occipital lobes and the primary visual cortex is what's known as blind sight. So blind sight is a condition where people know they will lose conscious access to visual information. That is, imagine a large gray spot over the entire visual field so that what you perceive is that there's nothing in your visual field but this grayish kind of spot, this giant scotoma. But when people who have this kind of visual perception are placed, for example, in an obstacle course, they will tend to avoid obstacles. Or in the real world, this has been observed when patients with blind sight they report that they have no visual sensation at all, but they will step over curbs without any problem. And so there's this sense in which there is some visual information that is getting into our brains that isn't necessarily part of our conscious visual processing. And that information can be used by other areas like the frontal lobes, which are planning our motor movements so that we can avoid obstacles and step over curbs, etc. One of the most important take-homes that I want you to leave this lecture with about the cerebral cortex is that although we talk about the different lobes as though they do these different specific functions like motor control and sensory input and visual processing, auditory processing, remember that all of the areas of the brain are communicating with each other in an effort to put our sensory world together. So when you even are watching this lecture, you are getting some auditory input and some visual input, and you don't necessarily have this impression that they're totally different parts of your sensory experience. They're kind of an integrated experience. So an example, just to bring this point home, is this Canisa drawing at the bottom of the screen. If I asked what you saw in this drawing, most people will report that they see a white triangle that is occluding parts of 3 circles and another triangle that's outlined in black. In fact, even if you look along this, most people report that they can see an edge that's continuous across this entire surface of the triangle. What's important to note here is that there is no triangle in the middle. There is only a few different sets of angles and 3 circles with pie-shaped slices cut out of them. What our visual system infers from that, based on our prior experience in the world, is that there must be something that's occluding these shapes. So the experience that you have, if you're having it, of a triangle sitting on top here, is one that is completely created by your brain and is part of your perception, even though it's not part of the visual processing per se. And that's because your visual areas, which are processing shapes and angles and colors, is interacting with other parts of your brain that have memories for these kinds of shapes and things you've interacted with in the past. And it's only as this perceptual whole that we experience the sensory input. We'll talk more later on about how this works in other senses like motor control and auditory senses. But I wanted to leave you with that example before we move into the subcortical structures of the brain.